My wife cheated on me with a guy from our kids' school. I exposed them both and destroyed their lives. But then, hey Reddit, I never thought I'd be the guy writing a post like this, but here I am. I'm Mark, and my wife's name is Jennifer. We've been married for 11 years, have 2 kids, and up until a few months ago, I thought things were fine. I work as a project manager for a construction company, and Jennifer's a nurse. We're the classic American couple, or so I thought. Looking back, the signs were there. Little things. She'd started working more late shifts, said she was getting more involved in the hospital's administration. But I didn't think much of it at the time. Our conversations started to feel distant. She used to greet me with a smile when I got home, but lately it was just a nod or nothing at all. The biggest change was the phone. Jennifer was never glued to her phone before, but now she'd be on it constantly. If I walked into the room, she'd lower the screen, or sometimes she'd just walk out altogether. It was subtle, but there was a pattern. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to be that guy, the paranoid husband reading into every little thing. After all, she's my wife, right? But things were about to change drastically. I had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole went. So, about a month ago, everything started unraveling. It was a Saturday morning, and Jennifer said she had to go into work for a few hours. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about her tone made me pause. She was rushing, nervous almost, and she wasn't wearing her usual scrubs. Instead, she was dressed up. When I asked why, she just brushed it off, saying she was meeting with hospital board members afterward. That same morning, I was cleaning up around the house when her phone buzzed. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, and she had left it behind in her rush. Now, I'm not the kind of guy to go through someone's phone, but my gut was screaming at me to check. It was just a quick glance, one message. It was from someone named Zach. I didn't know a Zach. The message read, "Can't wait to see you. Last night was amazing, face-blowing kiss." I froze. My stomach dropped, and my hands started shaking. There it was, the proof I didn't want but somehow knew was coming. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at that message. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was she really cheating? I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, but deep down I knew. When she got home later that afternoon, I acted like nothing was wrong. I needed time to figure out what to do next. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. That night, while she was in the shower, I decided to dig a little deeper. I scrolled through her messages with this Zach guy, and it didn't take long to confirm what I feared. They'd been seeing each other for months. The messages were flirty, explicit even. My heart shattered as I read them. I felt sick. How long had this been going on behind my back? And who was this guy? I didn't recognize the name, and there were no pictures of him in her phone. I needed more information. But more importantly, I needed to confront Jennifer. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions of work, pretending like everything was normal, but inside, I was spiraling. Every time Jennifer smiled at me or kissed the kids goodnight, all I could think about was Zach. My brain wouldn't shut off, replaying those texts over and over. The worst part? She acted like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't completely shattered our life. I knew I couldn't keep pretending forever. So, one evening after the kids were in bed, I decided it was time. I walked into the living room where Jennifer was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't have a plan for what I was going to say, but the words just spilled out. I know about Zach. Her eyes snapped up from the screen. For a split second, I saw panic, but she quickly masked it with indifference. "Who?" she asked too casually. "Don't play dumb, Jen," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "I saw the messages. You've been seeing him, haven't you?" She sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity. I thought maybe she would deny it, or make up some elaborate excuse. But instead, she let out a long sigh and said, "It's not what you think." That phrase. I've never hated a sentence more in my life. It's not what I think. How could it not be what I thought? I had seen the proof. I had read the messages. But before I could respond, she launched into her explanation. "We've just been talking, Mark. It's nothing serious. He's just a friend." A friend? A friend who talks about how amazing last night was? I shot back, barely keeping my voice down. "Do you think I'm stupid?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked down at her phone again, avoiding my eyes, which only made me angrier. I was ready for her to fight, to defend herself, but this cold indifference, cut me deeper than anything. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, but the words felt hollow, like she was only saying them because she knew she had to. "Sorry," I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You're sorry? That's all you have to say?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," she muttered, still not looking at me. Things haven't been great between us and I." "Stop," I interrupted. "Don't you dare try to blame this on us. This isn't about our marriage. You made a choice, Jennifer. You made a choice to go behind my back and sleep with someone else." The room was dead silent after that. I could see her lips quivering, but she still wouldn't meet my gaze. And that's when it hit me. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry she got caught. After that confrontation, things were tense, to say the least. Jennifer slept in the guest room, and we barely spoke unless it was about the kids. I could feel our whole life unraveling, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to work through it for the sake of our family. But every time I thought about her with Zach, the anger boiled up again. I couldn't look at her without seeing betrayal written all over her face. I needed clarity, and I needed a plan. I wasn't just going to let this slide. But I also wasn't going to explode and end up doing something I'd regret. That's when I realized I had to be smart about this. If I wanted any sort of closure or justice, I needed more information. I needed to know who this guy was and how deep this went. So, I did what any guy in my position would do. I started investigating. I knew Jennifer was too careful to leave anything obvious around, so I had to get creative. I started by going through her phone more thoroughly when she wasn't around, looking for anything that could give me a clue about Zach. I found his full name in one of their earlier messages, Zachary Thompson. The name didn't ring any bells, but with a little bit of digging online, I found out who he was. Turns out he was a divorced dad whose daughter went to the same middle school as our oldest. That stung more than I expected. This guy wasn't some random fling. He was right under my nose, probably smiling at me during school pickups while sneaking around with my wife. I also found out something else. Zach had a daughter, Emily, who was around 19. From what I gathered, she was living with him while going to college locally. It was a small detail, but it stuck in my mind for some reason. That's when the idea hit me. If Jennifer had been sneaking around behind my back, why couldn't I do a little sneaking of my own? Only this time, I wasn't interested in cheating. No, I had a different kind of plan, one that would expose both of them for the liars they were. I wasn't sure exactly how I'd pull it off, but I knew one thing. I was going to get close to Zach's daughter, Emily. Maybe not in the way Zach had gotten close to Jennifer, but enough to make him and her squirm. I wanted them to feel just a little of the betrayal they'd dealt me. With my plan in mind, I started by doing something that felt strange at first. I reached out to Emily. It was easier than I expected. Since we both had kids at the same school, I knew exactly where to find her on social media. I sent a casual message, saying I recognized her from the school events and mentioned that our kids were classmates. She responded politely, and that was all the opening I needed. I wasn't going to rush this. I had to be subtle. Over the next week or so, we messaged back and forth a few times. Nothing major, just small talk. I learned that she was a sophomore in college studying psychology. She seemed like a smart, down-to-earth girl, the kind of person you wouldn't expect to get tangled up in drama. That only made me feel a little guilty about what I was planning. But then I'd remind myself of what Jennifer had done. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about exposing the truth. And if that meant dragging Zach and Jennifer through the mud, then so be it. After a few days, I suggested we grab coffee. I played it off as a casual, neighborly gesture, and she agreed without hesitation. We met at a local cafe, and I was surprised by how easy it was to talk to her. She was friendly, funny even, and honestly, I could see why she had such a good relationship with her dad. It only fueled my determination. Over the course of our conversation, I subtly steered it toward her family. I asked how things were going at home, trying to get a sense of whether she knew about her dad's affair with my wife. Emily seemed oblivious. She talked about her classes, her part-time job, and how she'd been spending more time with her dad since his divorce. The more she talked, the more I realized she had no idea about the double life her father was leading. By the end of our coffee, I knew I was getting somewhere. Emily enjoyed our time together, and I could tell she was comfortable around me. That was exactly what I needed. If I could get close enough to her, maybe I could use her to expose the affair in a way that would ruin both Zach and Jennifer. It was risky. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but I had to keep reminding myself that they deserved it. I wasn't the one who started this mess, they did. Now, I just had to push things a little further and wait for the perfect moment to strike. After that coffee with Emily, I realized just how close I was to making this work. She was starting to trust me, and that was the key. But I still needed more. I needed to dig deeper into her life, and more importantly, her relationship with her dad, Zach. We kept chatting over the next week, and I made sure to sprinkle in casual compliments, just enough to keep her engaged without overdoing it. I wanted her to see me as someone she could trust, someone who was maybe a little more than just a neighbor. It didn't take long before she started opening up. One evening, she mentioned that her dad had been acting weird lately, spending a lot of time working late and disappearing on weekends. I tried not to react, but inside, I was boiling. This was exactly what I needed, confirmation that Zach was lying to Emily too, just like he was lying to me and Jennifer. How do you feel about that? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Do you think something's going on? She shrugged, clearly frustrated. I don't know. He says he's working, but sometimes it feels like he's hiding something. I don't know. I just don't want to think about it, I guess. Bingo. That was my opening. Listen, I said, leaning in just slightly, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. I know how family stuff can get complicated. She smiled, appreciating the gesture. Thanks, Mark. I might take you up on that. Over the next few days, Emily and I grew closer. I kept things friendly but flirtatious, making sure she saw me as someone she could trust. Meanwhile, I started putting my own pieces into place. I began collecting more evidence, going through Jennifer's phone whenever I had the chance, documenting her texts and photos with Zach. I wanted to have everything ready for when the time came to blow this thing wide open. And then, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Emily invited me to join her and her dad for dinner. She mentioned that Zach had been feeling distant lately, and she wanted to have a nice evening to reconnect with him. It was almost too perfect. Here was my chance to not only confront Zach, but to do it in a way that would leave both him and Jennifer scrambling for cover. I agreed to dinner, but in the back of my mind, I was already plotting how to turn this evening into their worst nightmare. The night of the dinner arrived, and I'll be honest, I was nervous. This wasn't just a casual meal anymore. It was a ticking time bomb. Emily had invited me over to her dad's house, completely unaware that I knew about his affair with Jennifer. Zach didn't know I was coming, and I had no idea how he'd react when I showed up at his door. But that was the whole point. I arrived at Zach's house with a bottle of wine, trying to keep my cool. Emily greeted me with a big smile, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. She had no clue what was about to go down, and I almost felt bad for dragging her into it. Almost. Zach was sitting at the dining table when I walked in. The moment our eyes met, I could see the panic flash across his face. He recognized me, of course. Our kids went to the same school. But more than that, I could tell he knew something was off. There was no mistaking the tension that instantly filled the room. Mark, he said, standing up awkwardly. I didn't expect to see you here. I smiled, acting casual. Emily invited me. I hope you don't mind. Zach glanced at his daughter, clearly trying to mask his discomfort. No, of course not. The more, the merrier. We sat down to dinner, and I could feel Zach's unease growing by the minute. He tried to make small talk, but it was painfully forced. Meanwhile, I made sure to drop little hints throughout the conversation, small, veiled comments about work, late nights, and how tricky it can be to balance everything when you've got a lot going on. I watched as Zach squirmed in his seat, knowing exactly what I was getting at. Emily, bless her heart, was completely oblivious. She kept the conversation light, talking about school and life, and I played along, pretending like nothing was wrong. But Zach knew. He knew something was coming, and he was powerless to stop it. Halfway through the meal, I decided it was time to turn up the heat. So, Zach, I said, casually swirling my wine glass. How's work been? I've heard you've been pretty busy lately. Late nights and all. His fork froze midair. For a split second, his eyes flicked toward Emily before he composed himself. Yeah, it's been hectic. You know how it is. Oh, I do. I replied, keeping my tone light. Juggling everything can be tough, especially when you're keeping secrets. Emily glanced between us, frowning slightly. Secrets? What do you mean? Zach's face went pale. He knew exactly what I meant. I could see the fear in his eyes, but before he could say anything, I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. I mean the kind of secrets that can tear families apart. The room went dead silent. Emily looked confused. Zach looked like he was about to throw up, and I just sat there, waiting for him to break. I wasn't going to let him weasel his way out of this one. Zach opened his mouth to say something, but I cut him off. Maybe we should ask Jennifer, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm sure she'd have a lot to add to this conversation. The moment Jennifer's name left my lips, Zach's face drained of all color. Emily, still confused, looked at me, then at her dad. Jennifer? Who's Jennifer? Zach stammered, trying to come up with a response, but I wasn't going to give him a chance. I turned to Emily, my expression softening. Emily, I'm sorry you're hearing this like this, but you need to know the truth. Your dad has been having an affair with my wife, Jennifer. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. For a moment, Emily just stared at me, processing what I'd said. Then she looked at her father, her face a mixture of disbelief and anger. Dad, she whispered, her voice trembling. Is that true? Zach sat there frozen, his eyes darting between us, looking for a way out. But there wasn't one. He knew he was caught. He sighed heavily and finally nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I didn't want you to find out like this, he muttered, avoiding eye contact with both of us. Emily's face crumpled. How could you? She asked, her voice cracking. How could you do this to Mom? And to me? Tears filled her eyes, and I could feel a pang of guilt. This wasn't her fault. None of this was her fault. But the truth needed to come out, even if it was painful. Zach didn't deserve to hide behind his lies anymore. I'm sorry, Em, Zach said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen. There it is again. I cut in, my voice laced with bitterness. The classic line, I didn't mean for it to happen. That's what Jennifer said too. Like affairs just happen by accident. Zach glared at me, but he didn't argue. He knew there was no point. The damage was done, and he had no one to blame but himself. Emily pushed her chair back and stood up, tears streaming down her face. I can't believe this, she said, shaking her head. You've ruined everything. She stormed out of the room, leaving Zach and me sitting in silence. He looked defeated, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd gone too far. But then I remembered everything he'd done, everything he'd taken from me. You brought this on yourself, Zach, I said quietly, standing up to leave. You and Jennifer deserve each other. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving him alone with the mess he'd made. After that dinner, everything came crashing down, exactly as I'd hoped, but it wasn't without its consequences. The next day, Jennifer confronted me. I hadn't expected her to find out so quickly, but Emily must have told her dad, and Zach, in turn, spilled everything to Jennifer. She stormed into the house, her face flushed with anger. Mark, what the hell did you do? She yelled as soon as she walked through the door. I was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for her. I told the truth, Jen. I told your lover's daughter exactly what's been going on behind everyone's back. You had no right, she shouted, her voice trembling. You've ruined everything. I stood up, my own anger rising. I've ruined everything? Are you serious right now? Jennifer? You were the one sneaking around with Zach, lying to me, lying to our kids. I just exposed the truth. She was furious, but I could see the guilt in her eyes, too. For all her bravado, she knew she had no moral high ground to stand on. She wanted to lash out, to make me the villain. But deep down, she knew this was all on her and Zach. You had no right to drag Emily into this, she said, her voice quieter now, the anger fading into something else, maybe regret. She's innocent in all this. I stared at her, my expression hard. And what about our kids, Jen? What about the damage you've done to them? To us? Do you think you were going to keep this secret forever? That it wouldn't blow up in your face? She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at the floor. The fight had gone out of her, and all that was left was the bitter reality of what she had done. I'm filing for divorce, I said, breaking the silence. I can't live like this anymore, Jen. You destroyed our marriage the moment you chose him over us. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Divorce? You can't be serious. I am, I said, my voice firm. I've already talked to a lawyer. I'm not going to let you keep dragging this out. For the first time since I found out about the affair, Jennifer looked scared. She tried to backtrack, to plead with me, but it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. We can fix this, she said, her voice shaking. We can work through it for the kids. I shook my head. No, Jen. There's no way anymore. You broke us. She stood there for a moment, processing my words. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. After Jennifer walked out, the house felt emptier than ever. The kids hadn't figured out what was going on yet, and I wasn't ready to tell them. Not until I had a plan for what came next. I sat at the kitchen table for what felt like hours, just staring at the spot where she'd stood. This was real. My marriage was over. No turning back. I knew I had to take action. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings with my lawyer, getting paperwork ready for the divorce. Every step felt surreal. The woman I'd spent over a decade with had betrayed me, and now I was dismantling the life we'd built together. It was like tearing down a house brick by brick, each piece a reminder of what was lost. The worst part, though, was dealing with the kids. They were young, and as much as I wanted to shield them from the mess Jennifer and Zach had created, I couldn't. They deserved the truth, at least a version of it. I didn't tell them about the affair. I just explained that their mom and I were having problems, and that we'd be separating. The looks on their faces were heartbreaking. I'll never forget the way they asked if it was their fault, or if we could fix things. I reassured them that none of this was on them, that we both loved them more than anything, and that we'd figure out a way forward. But deep down, I couldn't help but feel guilty. Even though it wasn't my affair, it still felt like I had failed them in some way, that I hadn't protected them from this fallout. As for Emily, she stopped responding to my messages after that dinner. I wasn't surprised. I had used her to get back at her dad, and while I had no regrets about exposing Zach, I knew it had hurt her in the process. I didn't blame her for cutting me off. But Zach, well, he wasn't going to get off that easy. He tried to reach out to me a few times, apologizing, trying to explain himself. Each time, I ignored him. I didn't need his excuses. What I needed was to rebuild my life without the weight of his lies and Jennifer's betrayal hanging over me. I had one final card to play, though. I wasn't just going to let Zach and Jennifer walk away from this without consequences. I couldn't let them walk away so easily. After everything they had done, they deserved more than just a clean break. While the divorce was in motion, I was still working on one last move that would leave them both reeling. I had gathered a good amount of evidence. Jennifer's texts with Zach, photos of their secret meetings, and even recordings of their conversations. It was all saved in a nice little folder on my computer, ready to be used if I needed it. But I wasn't planning on just sending it to my lawyer or using it for the divorce proceedings. No, I had something more public in mind. Zach was a well-respected guy in the community. He ran a local business, had a clean image, and people looked up to him. But that image was built on lies, and I wanted everyone to see the real Zach, just like I had. As for Jennifer, she cared more about appearances than anyone I'd ever met. Her social circle, her status in the hospital, all of it meant everything to her. If people found out about the affair, it would destroy the life she'd so carefully crafted. So I made a decision. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat down at my computer. I crafted a long email attaching all the evidence I had collected, the texts, the photos, everything. I didn't write much in the body of the email, just a simple explanation. This is the truth about Zach and Jennifer. Then I hit send. It didn't go to just one person. It went to everyone. Their coworkers, their friends, our mutual acquaintances. Anyone who knew Zach and Jennifer was about to see exactly who they really were. The fallout was immediate. The next morning, my phone blew up with messages and missed calls. Friends and family wanted to know if it was real, if the rumors were true. Jennifer called me, screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding to know why I would do something like that. But I didn't answer. I let her rage into my voicemail. I heard from a mutual friend that Zach's business started losing clients almost overnight. His clean image was shattered, and people who had once admired him now wanted nothing to do with him. As for Jennifer, word spread quickly at the hospital. She faced whispers and judgment from people she had once considered friends. Her perfect life was crumbling, just like mine had when I found out about the affair. Was it petty? Maybe. But after everything they'd done, I didn't feel an ounce of regret. They had torn my world apart, and now they were facing the consequences of their choices. I wasn't proud of myself, but I felt free. For the first time in months, I felt like I had control over my life again. After the dust settled from my email blast, life became oddly quiet. Zach disappeared from the public eye almost entirely. His once busy business now had a for sale sign hanging in the window, and from what I heard, he was considering moving out of town. I guess it was too embarrassing to stay in a place where everyone knew what kind of man he really was. As for Jennifer, she didn't lose her job at the hospital, but things were definitely different for her there. The friendly smiles and casual conversations she once enjoyed were replaced with cold stares and whispers behind her back. Her social life, once thriving, had dried up completely. She called me a few more times, but I never picked up. I had nothing left to say to her. The divorce papers were already moving through the court system, and the next time we'd speak would be in front of a judge. I tried my best to focus on the kids during all of this. They were the ones who mattered most, and I didn't want them to feel the weight of what was happening between their mother and me. It was tough, though. They could sense something was off, especially as Jennifer moved into a small apartment nearby and visitation schedules became a part of our new reality. One night, my daughter came to me, her face full of worry. "Dad, why did Mom have to move out? Did you guys have a fight?" I knelt down to her level, my heart breaking. "We're just going through some things, sweetie. It's not your fault. Your mom and I both love you very much. That will never change." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't fully understand. How could she? Kids shouldn't have to process this kind of pain. But I promised myself that no matter how bad things got between Jennifer and me, the kids would never suffer for it. As the days turned into weeks, I started to feel something strange, peace. For so long, I'd been consumed by anger, betrayal, and revenge. But now that everything was out in the open, I felt lighter. The weight of hiding, the sleepless nights filled with suspicion, the constant need for answers, it was all gone. One day, I was sitting on the porch, watching the kids play in the yard, when a thought hit me. I had survived. It wasn't the life I had planned, and it wasn't the future I had imagined, but I had made it through the worst of it. And in some strange way, I was stronger for it. That's not to say everything was perfect. There were still hard days, moments when the loneliness crept in, and I found myself wondering how things might have turned out if Jennifer had been faithful. But those moments were fleeting, and with each passing day, I grew more confident in the life I was rebuilding. As for Jennifer and Zach, well, they had to live with the choices they made. And that was enough for me. As the months passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The divorce was finalized without much drama. Jennifer and I split custody of the kids, and while things were still awkward between us, we managed to stay civil for their sake. She didn't fight for the house, which I was grateful for. The kids needed stability, and I was determined to give them that. Surprisingly, Jennifer didn't ask for much during the divorce proceedings. It was almost like she was too ashamed to fight for anything. She agreed to the terms quietly, and before long, we were officially divorced. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a relief. As for Zach, I didn't hear much about him after everything went down. Word on the street was that he'd sold his business and moved out of town. His daughter, Emily, stayed behind, though. We hadn't spoken since that disastrous dinner, but I occasionally saw her around town. We never exchanged more than a passing glance, and that was probably for the best. It took time, but eventually I found myself adjusting to single life. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, focused on work, and most importantly, poured all my energy into being a good dad. The kids needed me more than ever, and I wasn't going to let them down. I found comfort in the little things, picking them up from school, helping with homework, watching movies together on the weekends. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was a good life nonetheless. One afternoon, I got a text from a friend I hadn't heard from in a while. He was hosting a barbecue and invited me over. I almost didn't go, but something pushed me to say yes. Maybe I was ready for a fresh start, to move on from the mess Jennifer and Zach had left behind. The barbecue was just what I needed. Good food, good company, and for the first time in a long time, I felt happy. That's when I met Sarah. Sarah was a friend of a friend. Smart, funny, and refreshingly straightforward. We hit it off right away, chatting for hours about everything and nothing. There was something so easy about being around her, like I didn't have to try so hard. No games, no lies, just honesty. Over the next few weeks, we started seeing more of each other. At first, it was just casual, grabbing coffee, hanging out on weekends. But as time went on, it became clear that there was something more between us. I was hesitant at first. After what had happened with Jennifer, I wasn't sure if I was ready to open my heart again. But Sarah was patient. She understood what I'd been through and never pushed me to move faster than I was ready for. It wasn't long before the kids met her, and to my surprise, they loved her. Sarah wasn't trying to replace their mom, but she fit into our lives in a way that felt natural. Slowly, I started to feel something I hadn't in a long time, hope. With Sarah in my life, things started to feel brighter. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt like I was healing. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone like her. Someone who brought a sense of calm and joy into the chaos my life had become. It wasn't just about finding someone new. It was about rebuilding myself, learning to trust again, and letting go of the anger and betrayal that had consumed me. Sarah wasn't trying to fix me, and that's what I appreciated most. She gave me space when I needed it and stood by my side without pressuring me to move faster than I was ready for. It was the kind of relationship I hadn't known I needed. The kids were adjusting too. They loved spending time with Sarah, and she had a way of making them laugh, even on the hardest days. It was clear they were beginning to accept that life, though different, could still be good. Jennifer was still a part of their lives, but we kept our interactions limited to the essentials. She had her own life now, and so did I. There was a part of me that thought I'd never fully let go of what happened. The betrayal, the lies, they left scars. But those scars were starting to fade. I was beginning to see that life didn't end when my marriage did. It was just a new chapter. One afternoon, I took the kids out for ice cream. As we sat there, laughing and enjoying the sunshine, I realized something. I was happy. Not just content or getting by, but truly, deeply happy. And it wasn't because I'd gotten revenge or exposed the truth. It was because I had chosen to rebuild, to focus on what really mattered. My kids, my happiness, my future. Later that evening, Sarah and I sat on the porch, watching the sunset after the kids had gone to bed. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time, I talked about everything: Jennifer, Zach, the revenge, the aftermath. She listened without judgment, just letting me get it all out. When I finished, she took my hand and said, "You've been through hell, but you came out stronger. You deserve to be happy, Mark." And for the first time, I believed it. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The weight of everything that had happened was lifting. I wasn't the man I had been before, and that was okay. I had survived, I had healed, and now I was ready for whatever came next. A few months passed, and life finally felt stable again. The chaos of the past year had settled, and I had started to embrace the future. The kids were doing well, thriving in school and adjusting to our new normal. Jennifer and I had found a rhythm, and though our communication was strictly about the kids, it was civil. I was grateful for that. There was no point in dragging out the bitterness any longer. Sarah had become a big part of my life, but I was still cautious. It wasn't because I didn't trust her. If anything, she had shown me more trust and respect than I could have hoped for, but because I knew how fragile trust could be. I didn't want to rush into anything too quickly. But as time went on, I couldn't deny how good it felt to have someone in my corner, someone who had my back and cared for me in a way that was genuine and steady. One evening, after a particularly fun day at the park with the kids, Sarah and I sat down together at the kitchen table. She was helping me with the dishes, and we just started talking. It was easy, natural, like it had always been with her. But then, out of nowhere, she looked at me with this soft smile and said, "You know, I'm not going anywhere, Mark." I stopped what I was doing, looking at her, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't dramatic or overly sentimental. It was simple, honest, and that's when it hit me. I know, I replied quietly. I'm not either. It was a small moment, but it was the moment I knew I had fully moved on. I wasn't living in the shadow of Jennifer and Zach's betrayal anymore. I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next heartbreak. I had let go, and in doing so, I had allowed myself to truly start over. The next few weeks were a blur of happiness. Family outings, lazy weekends with Sarah, and watching my kids grow more comfortable in this new chapter. I even got back in touch with old friends, something I had neglected during the rough patches. It felt like I was rebuilding my life, brick by brick, and for once, I wasn't doing it alone. One night, while the kids were at their mom's, Sarah and I sat on the porch again, just like we always did. But this time, something was different. She reached in her bag and pulled out an envelope. "What's this?" I asked, curious. She smiled, handing it to me. "Just open it." Inside was a picture of a house. It was small, nothing fancy but cozy. The kind of place you could raise a family in. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, her voice soft but full of hope. "What if we found a place of our own? A new start, together." I looked at the picture, then at her. I hadn't realized how ready I was for this next step until that moment. The thought of building a new home with Sarah, of creating something just for us and the kids, felt right. It felt like the future I had been waiting for. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Let's do it." As we sat there, planning our future together, I realized something important. Life didn't end with Jennifer's betrayal. It was just a detour, a painful one, but a detour nonetheless. Now, I was on the path I was meant to be on, with people who cared about me, and with a future that was mine to shape. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back.